And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of you. Welcome to Conservation Voices. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Meredith Gore today, who's going to speak to us. And Meredith is going to talk to us about the importance, opportunities, and challenges of deepening integration of crime and conservation sciences, a fascinating topic for our Emerging Voices talk today. So just to describe the talk that Meredith is going to present, conservation crime is a global problem with broad social impacts. No socio-environmental system is immune. Interdisciplinary approaches like conservation criminology offer novel opportunities for innovation and solutions. However, its utility depends on serious reflection on the transposition of crime approaches to conservation contexts, which may differ in meaningful ways from traditional crime contexts. Meredith will use case studies on illegal fishing in Mexico and wildlife trafficking in Vietnam to facilitate dialogue about the importance, opportunities, and challenges of deepening integration of crime and conservation sciences. Now, a little brief about Meredith. Dr. Meredith Gore is an associate professor in the Department of Geographical Sciences at the University of Maryland. And at the National Academies of Sciences, she's a Jefferson Science Fellow. And at the US Department of State Intelligence, she is a research expert. Her research focuses on community-based conservation, conservation criminology, and the human dimensions of global environmental change. She's been a member of SCB since 2006, and she's a past president of the Social Science Working Group. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Meredith. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you so much, Tony and Lee and everybody from Society for Conservation Biology for having me here today. I see some friendly faces out there. Sheldon, good morning. Nick, I have no idea where in the world you are, but I imagine it's midday. And to all of you who are not drinking coffee with me, I hope you have a cocktail. I'm really excited to have a chance to connect with folks from SCB. I think this is the professional society that has meant the most to me personally and professionally throughout my career. And so I'm just really excited to have a dialogue today. Forgive me, I'm a morning person and I'm caffeinating. So I promise not to go too fast, but I'm really excited to be here today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and, hopefully provoke some thinking and some conversation amongst this group. I know a lot of the names here, and I know that thinking about conservation crime is not this is not a new issue. So I don't need to sort of go over the super basics of this. So I want to kind of reflect on some of the research that I've done and opportunities and challenges for deepening integration of conservation and crime science. So I guess I want to start off by just offering a roadmap of the presentation. I want to briefly review kind of the situation with conservation crime, talk about how interdisciplinarity is one way forward for conservation biology and thinking about solving conservation crime. I'd like to give some examples from current fieldwork in Mexico on sea cucumber trafficking, and also from Vietnam from illegal snare hunting. And then I want to kind of put five noteworthy points. I want to provoke conversation about 5 points that kind of I see on this issue. And so then we can have hopefully a discussion and dialogue about this. And so the event is being recorded. And so, hopefully what we discuss today might provoke thinking about others who can't join us today. So I want to acknowledge my motivations and experiences for being a conservation social scientist. I like to say that humans are my species. So I have a bachelor's in anthropology. I've had the good fortune to work all over the world, essentially wherever humans are distributed. And so that means that my work is inherently collaborative. And so that's actually how I met you, Tony, was through a conservation biology collaboration. I need conservation biologists to collaborate with and do my work. So I am fortunate in that I've been trained in interdisciplinary. My professional progression by design and then sometimes by accident has been very, very interdisciplinary. I do applied science, I conduct applied science. And so sometimes I work with the public, and then sometimes I work with federal agencies, sometimes I work with organizations and parastatals. So I really enjoy working, across the kind of governance spectrum. In the United States, we have a model of land grant universities. And so I was academically trained and have been tenured now at 2 land grant universities. This means that I look at science as an ally for decision making. I've also had a lot of support. I'm from a family of academics, and I've been able to be surrounded by individuals who have offered me a lot of support through professional and personal trials and tribulations. And so I also recognize that I have a really extensive personal and professional network that's enabled me to accomplish what I've accomplished. I also fail a lot. I'm going to talk mostly about solutions today, but I fail all the time, and I think I try to fail forward. So those are things that I think will underlie what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so conservation crime. For conservation biologists, I'd say, the top 6, would be, or top 5, we all know about wildlife trafficking as a conservation crime, IUU fishing, illegal logging, illegal mining. There's trade in electronic waste. There's fraud in carbon credit markets. And so conservation crime isn't a new issue, but the current scope and scale is unprecedented today. And so increasingly, we look at the causes and the consequences of conservation crimes, right? So we know that there's extreme violence involved, and this violence threatens animals, it threatens individual animals, populations, and it also threatens people. Probably many people know about Rory Young, who was unfortunately just killed in the line of duty in Burkina Faso last week, right? It's a really violent situation that we have going on right now. Wildlife trafficking and conservation crime, it undermines the rule of law. It lowers the return on sustainable development investments that taxpayers make and that government donors make. It removes taxable revenue from the legal supply chain. A lot of the times natural resource use is legal. And when we engage in illegal natural resource use, we're kind of removing the taxes that legal supply chains are designed to generate. There's a lot of degradation of cultural resource and heritage for diverse traditional peoples, local communities. For a long time, the wildlife trafficking and conservation crime community has been talking about biological invasions, zoonotic disease spread. Wildlife trafficking and other conservation crime converges with other forms of serious crime, money laundering, wire fraud, sometimes racketeering, and other types of drugs, smuggling of drugs or guns. It fuels corruption and other forms of criminality, particularly when it involves transnational or kind of cross-boundary spaces. And it also really magnifies environmental structural injustices. So many places in the world where you have conservation crime really disproportionately impacting humans that are already vulnerable, and also wildlife species and ecosystems that are vulnerable. So science is an ally, right? So what is the state of science in support of solutions? Like, what does it look like to engage in science on conservation crime? So I have 4 observations, and I'm sure, I'd love to hear more about what you all experience. But, a lot of the times when we're doing research in this space, you have stakeholders like victims and actors that are silent, and they have limited societal interfaces. Maybe that's because they're trees and they can't talk, or they're elephants and scavengers have come and scavenge the entire carcass before a forensic team can show up. Or you have human victims that maybe don't speak the language of a researcher from the global north who is disproportionately involved in researching this problem. So there's all these different limited societal interfaces that complicate the state of science in support of solutions. The conservation community suffers from incredible fragmentation of data. Our data sets are not comprehensive. there's a reluctance and an inability to share data. This is something that I feel very passionately about, and I sometimes get on a soapbox about, so I apologize, but this is a serious issue for identifying trends and evaluating these issues. The behaviors that we study are often covert, and they involve really dynamic adaptation, and animals and people both avoid detection. Also, scientific resources are limited, and sometimes they're insufficient to combat the problem. And so this is unique. You know, we're not a field of global health. We're not a field of, you know, women's education. I know that these are all fields that suffer from resource limitations and inadequacies, but the state of science in support of solutions on conservation crime, we're kind of hamstrung by at least these 4 issues. So what I kind of have been focused on, as some of you know, and some of you are focused on this, is understanding that scientific solutions to these problems require interdisciplinary thinking. So conservation biology at the top. We need to be thinking about how human and natural systems are coupled. How do ecosystems function? What are the ecosystem services? How do ecosystems engage in, you know, how do they respond to global environmental change? And then, you know, conservation biology involves social science. So there's sustainable development, preservation, you know, human attitudes, et cetera, traditional knowledge, and local communities. When you're dealing with conservation crime, though, there's also a huge dimension of criminology and crime science. So here we're really able to draw on a science that tells us, you know, what are the opportunities, the physical, environmental opportunities that underlie crime? How do we control crime and prevent crime from occurring in the first place? This is really important because, you know, unlike automobile theft, where, you know, I may have insurance or somebody may replace an inanimate object, once a orangutan is dead, it's dead. You know, once a rosewood tree is cut, it's cut. And so a lot of the times in conservation, we're also thinking about compliance with rules and how to deter people from breaking rules. And really, crime science and criminology has a lot to offer from this space. And then I'd be remiss to not recognize the fact that risk in decision-making is inherent to these solutions. We're looking for data-driven decision-making. We're trying to improve decision-making. We're analyzing risks, we're managing risks, we perceive risks, and we're also communicating risks. And the field of risk and decision-making really offers a lot of best practices and a massive knowledge base about how to incorporate this. These dimensions. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us with interdisciplinarity. And so, you know, I hear this word, I see it implemented all the time, and I think it has a lot to offer, but it's hard, right? So conservation criminology, you know, where those of us that are in this space, this is just one representation of it, but you essentially, you know, have it. You have like 4 overlapping spheres. You have a situation where there's some conservation problem, there's some rule violation and harm that's happening, and then you need to understand, you know, what is the risk and decision-making process? What's the governance? What's the, you know, what does the science say? What do local people say? And then what is the criminology and criminal justice dimension? What are the criminogenic aspects of this problem? And then, of course, you know, what are we talking about in terms of community ecology and ecosystem function? And so when you put all of this together, this interdisciplinary space is conservation criminology. So great. So we have problems in the United Nations and Society for Conservation Biology and the US government and the African Union. Everybody says, you know, these are important issues. So, you know, this is one interdisciplinary science to think about this. So one review of literature. So here's a review of literature that I conducted with my friend and colleague Abby Bennett. And so here's a review of that review. So what we did is we wanted to say, okay, well, what is when you look at how, you know, crime science has been applied to conservation, what do we see? And we only see 6 kind of primary ways that crime is applied to conservation, or crime science is applied to conservation science. And so this is like jargon, but I want to put it out there to provoke thinking, right? So there's choice structured properties. So these are theories from criminology and crime science that talk about the structure of offenses and offender choices. There's hot products analysis, like what makes an object attractive to thieves, this craved or captured analysis. There's crime scripting, right? So this offers like a step-by-step review of how crime is sequenced so that you can intervene in certain points. Distance decay, which tells us that most crime is committed nearer rather than farther to offenders' territories. There's risky facilities, trying to understand the attributes of locations where far more crime occurs over others. And then situational crime prevention. These are opportunities and constraints on crime situations. So what we see is that only 6 types of crime science have been applied to conservation essentially so far, so that leaves a lot of room for growth. So now is a time to kind of reflect on that. What I want to do now is kind of shift to 2 illustrative examples of the applications of crime science to conservation. And so, in the past kind of 2 months, 2 papers have come out that kind of illustrate this. The first is kind of what I'm basing this talk on today, and this is about sea cucumber poaching and trafficking in Yucatan in Mexico. And sea cucumbers are a legal fishery, but there's illegal fishing that happens on top of this. This space, and then there's also this paper that came out on crime script analysis to understand wildlife poaching and illegal snare hunting in Vietnam. And so, these are all open access publications, but what they offer is an illustration of how crime science can be applied to conservation. So I want to talk about those a little bit. So the sea cucumber poaching and trafficking issue, what we've been doing is using kind of participatory mapping and this tool from crime science called crime place network interactions. And what this offers is that there are 4 important places that you need to think about when you're talking about commission of a crime: comfort spaces, corrupting spots, convergent places, and then the crime site. So a lot of the times when we're thinking about crime, you're like, oh, this is where the elephant was killed. This is where the vulture was poisoned. This is where the shark was finned. Okay, that may be your crime site. But then comfort spaces, like where do offenders go when they're not offending? How corrupting spots, how are offenders brought into the fold? Like where do new offenders come from? And then convergent spaces, are there places where conservation crime overlaps other crimes? So crime place network interactions was actually born out of the field of policing in 2 cities in the United States, Cincinnati and Las Vegas, that were experiencing really high rates of homicide. And what the researchers noted is that you need to focus on more than just the homicide space. You need to think about how crime places interact across a landscape. And so what we've done is we've applied this notion to sea cucumber fishing and poaching and trafficking in Mexico. I've also done this on illegal wild meat trade in Kinshasa in Brazzaville. I'm not talking about that today, but this crime place network interaction idea is really interesting. So what we did is we went into certain communities in Mexico that I'm not going to mention, and we engaged in participatory mapping. Where are the crime places? Where are the convergent spots? Where are the corrupting points? Where are the comfort spaces? And so you can see these PNI categories over here, and they're color coded, right? And then we asked people, and then we identified, is this a bodega? Is this like a housing? Is this a fishing cooperative office? Is this city hall? What are the places? So we identified the places with certain symbols, and then we asked participants, fishers, to rank these ideas as these places as being high, medium, low risk. And so what you can see is a bunch of scribbles on the page, but what you can start to see is patterns, right? And so we have some really high crime spaces surrounding comfort spaces. What was really interesting is as we started to go into here, what we saw is that these are Airbnbs that local women are actually renting to illegal fishers. And so this is an opportunity to intervene, thinking about the places where offenders go when they're not offending, they're going to houses. So trying to like work with people when they're actually not offending is one way to think about trying to reduce and prevent crime. What's also really interesting here is that we were able to engage a group of people, local women, that hadn't previously been involved in the solution set for sea cucumber poaching and trafficking. So what we're doing now is we are designing, implementing, and then evaluating community-based interventions to try to reduce the crime rates of sea cucumber poaching and trafficking in these communities. Turning to Vietnam, we've adapted this idea of crime scripting of snare poaching in 3 different protected areas, Pumat, Hue, Quan Nam. And snare poaching is ubiquitous in these areas, and it causes major threats to biodiversity. So again, a lot of the times when we think about crime, we think about this is the crime place. Well, what crime science tells us is that there's 9 stages in commission of a crime. And these 9 stages can apply to conservation, they can apply to financial fraud, they can apply to homicide, they can apply to home burglaries. And so what we did is we wound up going out and interviewing close to 300 group individuals in these protected areas, and we started to understand the stages or the sequence of events that are involved in crime in snare poaching in protected areas. And then what we did is we compared these 9 stages for 3 different groups: local kind of traditional snare hunters, professional inside snare hunters, and professional outside snare hunters. And the reason why we distinguish them this way is it's really the professional outside snare hunters that we're really trying to focus on. Those are the ones that are considered kind of the most bad, I guess. And so what we found is that across all these different individuals, there are 4 types of there's 4 stages of the crime commission process that are held in common, and there are 5 that are different. And what this really helps us to do is identify a range of entry points for intervention, and also to help starting to distinguish between the kind of local people who are engaged in subsistence-based activities versus those that are involved in more professional transnational crime. So what do you do with all this information? We also wound up in Vietnam creating a crime triangle, right? So the crime triangle tells us that we need to be thinking about the suitable target, the motivated offender, and the lack of guardianship. And so when these 3 conditions overlap in space and time, you have illegal snare hunting that occurs. That's this circle in the middle. And so what we did is we said, okay, well, there's terrestrial species. These are our targets. And we have 3 hunter types. And we're really thinking about guardians that are in protected areas like rangers or youth unions or women's groups, that type of thing. And so what we did is we were able to start distinguishing between who is responsible, who has the authority for deterrence, where are the guardians, and how do they go about preventing illegal snare hunting. And so this offered a different way of thinking about the problem and also different entry points for intervention. So this enables more strategic prevention, also better investment of resources, more like effective investment in resources. Okay, so now what I want to do is really start reflecting on kind of some of the importance and the opportunities and challenges associated with what happens when you do interdisciplinary science, like what I just talked about in Vietnam and Mexico. And I know a lot of you, just recognizing names in the Zoom gallery thing, whatever. I know you all are doing a lot of field work, and you kind of know that. So can you elaborate on these opportunities and challenges? Can you push back? Can you refine them? Let's do that. So the first thing that I want to, when we're dealing with conservation, we're dealing with a whole different problem set when it comes to harm and victim. You know, in traditional crime, you know, you have a car accident, you have car theft, you have homicide, you have a drug offense. But in conservation crime, sometimes there's no easily specifiable set of individuals. There's a broad range of harms and victims. So for example, with sea cucumber poaching, are we talking about one sea cucumber? Are we talking about a population of sea cucumbers? Are we talking about one illegal fisher? The boat of fishers? You know, what's our unit of analysis? And who is harmed at what point in the crime commission process? Is it the fishers that are actually in the water fishing the illegal sea cucumbers? Is it the retailers who are selling illegally caught sea cucumbers online? Is it the general public who lives in the village where the sea cucumbers are illegally fished and are dealing with just like, you know, crime, like this general dimension of criminality? How do we scale these harms and victims across scale, right? And this idea of multiple harms with cumulative impact across large spatial scales is unique to conservation. So cutting one rosewood tree illegally in Madagascar versus a forest or you know, a whole protected area, the harms accumulate, and this is something that is a challenge in conservation. And right now, the crime sciences really don't attend to this diffusion of harms and victims very well. So there's opportunities for growth there. This idea of scalar mismatching is hugely problematic because of the fact that, you know, conservation crime is so transnational today. So because it's so globalized, you know, a lot of the times you're having so many jurisdictions cross. So you're crossing state lines, you might cross national lines, you might cross park boundaries, you might cross a village boundary. And so what is the law being violated? Who has the authority? What is their jurisdiction? And what law are you actually going to use to prosecute a crime or sanction a crime? And so this idea of matching a crime behavior versus crime governance or jurisdiction is hugely problematic. So, you know, a Michigander, you know, in the United States who illegally poaches a black bear is violating, you know, local and national laws. It's only when the gallbladder of that illegally poached black bear is transnationally trafficked, you know, in illegal methods, that you have transnational laws that start to come into play. So what are you going to prosecute these people for? How are you going to sanction them? What is the crime behavior of interest, and who has jurisdiction over this? Even within agencies, is it, you know, a Department of Justice? Is it a Department of Commerce? You know, and so I think the scalar mismatching is widely problematic. And again, it poses a huge challenge to conservation crime, but it's also an opportunity for science to kind of grow, I think, and inform ways to do better matching of scales. You know, of course, you know, the illegal converges with the legal. You know, you have, you know, activity that occurs in the same place, often in the same areas, at the same time periods, the methods of take, and the same stakeholders, right? So you have illegal activity that's hiding in plain sight. And so, you know, you think about, you know, if a tree is illegally, you know, logged, you know, does somebody see it? You know, well, no. And sometimes you can obfuscate illegal activity with legal activity, right? And so we see this with illegal trade in reptiles, and we see it with the sea cucumber example. Really provides a great use case for this, because you have illegal fishers and legal fishers often next to each other at the same time, using the same tools to take their fish. And how are you supposed to distinguish between the legal and the illegal? And then how are you supposed to support legal activity and deter illegal activity? This is something that is hugely problematic for conservation. And again, criminology and crime science hasn't really brought us to where we could be for this topic. There's also laws without locals, right? And so you have laws are made at in a Capitol building or a national capital. And a lot of times you have natural resource laws that are established without consultation of local users. You know, in Vietnam, a lot of the protected areas that I do research in, you know, involved you know, there's some land tenure issues with local people. Local people are not always, were not always consulted when original laws were created. And so the legitimacy of these laws is varied. And then a lot of the times you have national laws or the rule of law that is combined with traditional laws, right? And so there's human, oops, there's a typo, sorry. You know, you have these human environment relations that are not always, you know, incorporated into law. You also have the situation where you have formal regulations that are created on top of or that undermine local governance and local kind of social norms about who makes decisions, how people are penalized for violating rules, that type of thing. And the other thing that I think is really important when you think about laws without locals, communities are increasingly asked, right? So community-based conservation, and now it's community-based crime prevention. Do communities even want to engage in some of these crime prevention activities? And so there's this top-down imposition of, you know, going to communities and saying, you know, you can be a guardian against illegal fishing in Mexico, or, you know, here's a youth union and you guys are really well positioned to be a guardian for, you know, Pumat National Park. How can you, you know, contribute to community-oriented policing? And a lot of the times communities are being asked to control crime and may not be given the resources to do so. The last kind of observation that I think is really, really important to think about with regard to conservation crime and moving forward is the integration of natural science into legal frameworks. And I just saw Dr. Helen Agu join the call. Hello. And so this is something that you know, Dr. Agu encourages me to think about because she's an environmental lawyer. And the idea is, how is natural science integrated into a legal policy, right? So a lot of the times you have natural science data that really isn't able to be fused with non-natural science data. And that makes incorporating science into law challenging. It also creates a huge high information burden on natural scientists. So that means that in addition to natural scientists going out there, or conservation social scientists going out there and collecting all this data, dealing with reliability, dealing with validity, that we now have to be thinking about translating and fusing our data to decision makers. And this is just more work. It's a huge information burden on natural science. What information is useful to decision makers? And then, you know, we have different expectations about how decisions and decision-making processes are informed by natural science, biology, ecology, sociology. And then how that kind of gels with the rule of law, and then also like law enforcement in the criminal justice system. So although we would like to often aspire to evidence-based policy, a lot of the times the science is lost for a whole host of reasons. And this is challenging when it comes to conservation crime because the conservation biology is so important. So what I'd like to do now, what I'd like to do now is have a discussion and dialogue about these issues, because I think that there's, you know, those of you that know me know that I'm a chronic optimist. Those of you that don't know me, I'm telling you, like, I really do fundamentally believe that science can be an ally. So how can we try to move the needle? I observe that there's a lot of promise with interdisciplinarity, but you know, I want to acknowledge that participatory approaches, interdisciplinary approaches, a lot of the times they have high transaction costs over the short term, but can be more sustainable in the long term, more kind of self-regenerating, more adaptable, and more resilient. But how are we supposed to weigh the transaction costs of short-term and long-term transaction costs, especially when you're dealing with this urgency that we have in conservation biology. One of the things that I've noticed is that we can really engage local people as informants rather than offenders. When I go into communities, well, first of all, I have no authority. I mean, I'm just a scientist, but, looking at local people as informants rather than offenders, it produces much more accurate on the ground insights, and it avoids negative judgments about natural resource use. At the end of the day, we can't ignore the major issues of justice, the major issues of, the North-South divide and privilege, and more that go into these interactions. And so I think that collaboration and engagement, as opposed to, combativeness, can go a long way. I've talked a lot about scaling, but, what works in one location and context may not work in another, but there are tools and theories that can scale across contexts. And I think that these crime science approaches are really exciting. They're often designed in urban areas and we're applying them in rural areas, or vice versa. And I think that there's some really interesting translations across the global North and global South that we can think about. And I also think that it's really useful to think about how crime prevention can complement many other types of interventions, like social media campaigns and educational outreach and things like that. But measuring the success of crime that hasn't been, or measuring crime that hasn't been committed, is really hard. And so, we need to, in my opinion, we need to do a better job of measuring success, but that's hard. So just want to throw that out there. Okay, so what? So I'd like to pose some questions to you. These are, what will it take to make science an ally? There are so many. I think it's important, but I think that there's opportunities and challenges to deepening integration of conservation and crime sciences. But what's it going to take to make science an ally for decision making? And what can we do to leverage the impact of science? How can we better promote a re-examination of, historical and current power relationships? I think that, in the United States, which is where I live, so that's the country that I know best, we're having a reckoning right now with policing. And so, we need to be thinking about power and history, and how we can not bring negative aspects of our science to the table when we're moving forward with these conservation crime solutions. I think there's a lot of opportunity for conservation to, particularly with regards to community-based management, to inform what's happening with criminology. And then how can we build capacity to identify unsustainable decisions and the role of natural science in decision making? How can we try to overcome the limitations, the 5 kind of limitations that I identified earlier in the talk? So those are some of the things that I thought about. And because I teach online, what I did is, and I'll put this in the chat, but what I did is I created a Jamboard for us. If we are interested, you can join the Jam, and this link should theoretically be open to anybody that wants to participate. And then this can live on the Conservation Voices website or whatever. But sometimes when I've had these conversations during these virtual lectures, people have like all these resources and all these comments that they put in the chat box, and I think that's awesome. So if you want to, I'll just put that in the chat, which I think everybody can access. But if you want to jam here, theoretically, you should just be able to like go in and start typing in. And so with that, I would just like to acknowledge like a ton of collaborators, funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, funding from Global Wildlife Conservation. And I really hope that I have an opportunity to interact with you all. Feel free to email me or tweet, whatever, or check out my website. And I just want to say, thank you very much to the Society for Conservation Biology for having me here for this Conservation Voice, experience. I'm planning on going to Kigali if I can. So with that, I guess I'll just stop sharing and open it up for questions or comments or anything like that. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. Or we can just chat.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. If anybody has questions for Meredith, please type them into the chat and we'll answer them one by one. Meredith, I've got a question for you while we're waiting for questions to be typed in. So we see many governments, police agencies and enforcement agencies doing media exercises where they're showing confiscations as evidence of enforcement success. And we see in the newspaper and on TV, we see confiscations of X tons of pangolin scales, X tons of ivory, and this is being passed off as success. Now, what do you feel about enforcement success measured by confiscations and numbers of arrests?
Yeah, so that's a loaded question. So I think that one question to ask like a scientist, what is a measure of success, right? I mean, I think that disrupting supply chains, like removing tons of pangolin scales or airport seizures. I mean, I think those are really important, and I think that the law enforcement authorities that I know, are often overworked and underpaid. And so, if they can be lauded for, doing the right thing, I think that's really good. I think, there are challenges associated with seizures and arrests, though, in terms of data. I think that it's limited. But a lot of the times it's all we have, right? So there's detection probabilities. They're not necessarily accurate numbers. And then the way the numbers are measured change over time. And so that has implications for how we assess trends, right? So is something increasing or decreasing? And are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring? And I think that this is hugely problematic in conservation. My observation is that we don't standardize our data on conservation crime at all. And I think that's to our detriment. We can't assess trends over time. Like I have a friend who does work in, she's a mathematical ecologist, and she studies monarch migration throughout the United States, through North America. And there's a standard way of monitoring populations and assessing trends. So they can actually determine, what's happening with monarch populations at a big scale, at a small scale. We can't do that with conservation crime because we focus on arrests, we focus on seizures, and then we don't share data. Data is very proprietary, and even scientists don't share data. And I think I say personally, I say shame on us. We can do better. That's my opinion alone. So I think there's pros and cons with it, Tony. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I think, the Thai police are very well known. I mean, Bangkok is a huge hub for wildlife trafficking, and it's a hub. And so when things come in, they catch it. I don't know. I mean, like Sheldon, what do you think? I mean, what do the rest of you think? Is it good, or is the best we can do? I don't know. So I will say, right, that one thing would be that, some law enforcement authorities that I know say that they would rather do, what's it called? A controlled delivery, right? So instead of removing the pangolin scales from the system, when you catch it, you track it, and then you build a case, and then you are able to collect evidence that is really, really strong and holds up in a court of law that you can then use to prosecute somebody and sanction them very heavily. And so that's often considered a more dramatic way of disrupting a wildlife trafficking supply chain.
Thanks, Meredith. We've got a couple of questions here. Sergio had two questions. The first question is, what guidelines can the conservation community provide to social media and other online platforms towards halting wildlife crime?
I love that question. So yeah, I mean, we do a terrible job communicating sometimes as scientists, right? And so I think that what we do inadvertently, I think in trying to share our science and tell somebody how significant the problem is, we wind up communicating how rare these species are and how special they are, because they are, right? But it's perverted sometimes. So I think that it would be awesome for conservation communities or scientists or Society for Conservation Biology, maybe like the social marketing group or the social science working group, to come up with guidelines. And so I think that the idea here would be, if and when you're called to, to speak to media and engaging with media, either like proactively to highlight, work that's been done, or like reactively, like when there's a case. I think having those guidelines would be really good. One thing that I will note is that I just had a chance to talk with some law enforcement authorities in the state of Washington. They indicted and prosecuted somebody for anyway, when they put out the press release about the Department of Justice press release, it was about traditional Chinese medicine. And so the information was also translated in Chinese. So sometimes it could just be like super, super simple, like translate outside of English, please, so that like other non-English speaking individuals can participate in this. So I think that there are definitely best practices, Sergio. If you have ideas, maybe you could put them on the Jamboard, or others could put them on the Jamboard, because I think that there are definitely best practices in risk communication, particularly, that we can use. Is that okay, Tony? Is that a good answer?
That's great. Yeah, it's a great answer. I think we've got some other questions for you here that we'll move on to. From Elizabeth Davis. Hello, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us. I have a hard and somewhat philosophical question for you. You mentioned the counterfactual of crime prevention strategies combined with, for example, demand reduction strategies. To me, that implies that there's a possibility that one could negatively impact the other. Do you think that is possible? Have you seen it happen? Or do you think such combination of strategies would always be effective?
I think that's a really interesting question. So I guess the idea is like, so what a lot of crime analysts look at are crime rates, right? And so these are crimes that are reported. So in a human society, homicides are reported, domestic violence, rape, burglary. I'm not trying to get too dark here. And there's issues associated with those reporting, but humans report. And so there are these baselines, and you can assess trends over time. So when it comes to assessing crime rates in conservation, we don't have good baselines, but then how are you supposed to measure, like how are you supposed to generate an effect statistic essentially for something that hasn't happened? And so what I would argue actually is that what I see is that there are some computer scientists who have a lot to offer in this space and modeling. So I think there's an opportunity to look at investment, and if we are able to do like investment of interventions, and if we're able to do a better job, the scientific community, of actually standardizing our data, fusing data and assessing trends over time, then we could work with machine learning experts or just data analysts, crime analysts, to really determine what kind of effect an intervention had on crime reduction. No, I don't think that crime prevention is always going to be effective. I think you also need crime response. I think that preventing crime is less expensive sometimes than responding to crime, and that's for everything. And the social cost too, right? So the social cost of dealing with, rangers who have been killed in the line of duty, poachers who have been killed, and what happens to the families after that. So I think that we should we need all hands on deck, all strategies on deck. But I think that crime prevention has been underutilized, and data-driven decision-making has been underutilized in conservation crime.
Yeah, and we've also got algorithms that are being developed to predict where crime will occur. Mm-hmm. And some of those algorithms are being used now to develop applications right. like PAWS, mm-hmm. where we're taking poaching data and we're modeling it and trying to figure out where crime might occur, and then sharing that with ranger teams and getting them to go out and test whether there's actually crime happening at the places where it's being predicted to occur. And there's some very interesting results coming from the application of this approach in places like Cambodia, where WWF has been applying this technique called PAWS in combination with smart patrol data and figuring out where crime is occurring. And this is also being tested in other places, in Zambia and other countries too. So I think that there's a lot of future for predictive modeling of crime that can help us to prevent the crime from occurring, and maybe reducing the cost of enforcement. If we can prevent the crime from occurring in the first place, that's obviously beneficial.
Right. So I think, so there's this whole movement, AI for social good. So Google is doing it, Mill and Tombe at Harvard, Bistro Delkina at the University of Southern California. These are really amazing computational scientists who are like dying for, conservation data that is like comprehensive so that they can model these types of things. And so there's a real opportunity for collaboration. If we could just get our data standardized and integrated. I'll stop. I'm preaching this now, so sorry.
A question from Nick. So I very much relate to the fragmented data and reluctance to share a lot consistent data capture regimes, if any. We're struggling with the very same issue to find out whether a particular intervention has been effective or not. Often we deal with other stakeholders who are not scientists themselves and may not always understand that science can be an ally. What would be promising approaches to start unlocking those data sets or information?
So, hi, Nick. It's nice to see you. I agree. And one of the things that I think first of all, I think we need to standardize our data. And so I've been working on this effort since 2018. I have this manuscript. We have 30 authors from really amazing NGOs and scientists, and it's really hard to publish because it's interdisciplinary. So hopefully, actually it's on my website, right? So this is a participatory generated, so standardizing data. I think it's like if I go to see Tony in Thailand and I get my blood pressure taken, it's going to be measured in the same way as if I, stop off and see Helen in Nigeria and then come back to Maryland, right? You can't merge wildlife trafficking data or conservation crime data. So if we could start with that, if some leader like SCB or the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime could say, we need to standardize data, here's what we endorse. And by the way, other fields do that. Like conservation isn't unique in this space. We're just resistant to it. In my opinion. Then we need donors to start requiring data be collected in this way. So fine, I have NSF funding, I have US Fish and Wildlife Service funding, I have funding for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. No one's telling me how, I can use the methods that I think are appropriate as a scientist to achieve my objectives. In addition to that, I can collect my data in a format that can be publicly shared, sterilized, not incriminate anybody, but also do trend identification. So I would say conservation can learn from other communities. I mean, this is like the Red Cross does this for refugees. The medical industry does it for blood pressure. The policing industry does this for narcotics trafficking and nicotine. Like everybody else is doing it. Why can't we? So I would say, look at other fields and just adapt it. And we need, and also we need to kind of be tough and talk to ourselves in the like we need to have a conversation amongst ourselves in the conservation community about why these barriers, they're normative barriers that exist to sharing data. I think we can overcome them.
Thanks, Meredith. A question from Sheldon, the importance of community relationships in crime prevention, such as elders. How can we build these better into our strategies, both in terms of understanding issues and responses, noting that an impact of colonial history here in the Americas has bred great distrust over time?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So this is like one of those like long game type questions, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Sheldon. I think that one of the things that we can do in the scientific community is train local scientists. And so, when we go into, other countries, or even other communities, really trying to build the capacity of locals to be our research assistants or our graduate students, and then trying to work with them to return to their home institution. We can kind of, so there's like a pipeline issue there, I might say. I also think that there are there are best practices about how to do kind of environmental justice research, or like environmentally just research and socially just research. And so, thinking about the political ecology fields, and what they say. So I don't have anything like specific other than to say that there are bodies of knowledge that we can use to decolonize our research. Actually, later this month, I'm speaking, what is her name? She's like this amazing medical geographer who went to Michigan State University, and now she's at Harvard, and we're on a panel together, and she's been doing this work on like, in Madagascar, it's like public health, but she's talking about like decolonizing. So it's like an internal team member who's talking about decolonizing the process of research. So again, I would say, and this is like health, like it might even be like COVID related or like nutrition related. So what can conservation learn from other fields and apply to decolonizing our research? And then this would also be like promoting DEI and AR, right? Anti-racism dimensions as well. We can do this, I think. That's a good question, Sheldon. Thank you.
And we have the last question, Sergio. My question is, how can we support governments to ensure the safety of wildlife defenders, those on the front lines of wildlife crime? Great question.
Sergio, I wish I had like a really good answer. Because I just lost a friend last week to this, and he was with a team that had a lot. I mean, he was with a team, right? And they were armed. So, how do you support governments to ensure the safety of wildlife defenders? I mean, wildlife defenders need to be well trained in de-escalation, and then I think also we need to make smart decisions about what we're asking conservation and wildlife defenders to do. I noticed that sometimes conservation defenders or environmental defenders are put in places where the military often operates. And so this like bleeding between, conservation and insurgency, or conservation and conflict zones. I don't know if that's kind of what you're referring to, Sergio, but like, I think that those that make decisions about putting conservationists on the front line to begin with should be reevaluating our training, right? So I train conservation biology students. I can teach you how to do a mean online survey. What I can't teach you how to do is like, go into a conflict zone where there's militia groups there. So I think we should continue talking about this, Sergio, and then I think that we should also recognize that wildlife defenders are not every defender for every single thing, right? So, I don't know. That's what I would say. Tony, you do a lot of stuff in this space too, though. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think wildlife defenders, we need training, but we need training in how to defend ourselves in operating procedures in conflict zones. We've lost people in parts of the world where I work, in projects where I work, and we're talking about having the standards for operating in the field, not just how much rice you take out to stay out on in the forest for a week, but how do you avoid getting shot? How do you avoid getting into an argument with somebody? How do you avoid getting into a violent situation? And that training needs to be standardized. We need to have approaches that we teach to field teams so that they're ready, so that they can avoid getting injured or killed.
Right. And then there's issues of like human rights violations. And then, we need to, so the training can go a long way. And I also think that, I just remember when I was out on patrol with a group of defenders in the Omo in Ethiopia, they learned by trial and error that they had to have a team of 6 and women. And they also needed to make sure that the team was from all the different villages. So they needed really diverse, they needed really high ethnic diversity. And that was the way that they avoided getting stoned. And so we can share those stories in training and also professionalize. But I think also, governments need to recognize that conservation, just because the conservation community works in rural areas where some, insurgents operate, doesn't mean that the conservation community is the only one responsible for that. Sergio, I think you should dig into this. I think it's a really interesting topic.
Wonderful. We're actually past the hour now, but I wanted to ask you, Meredith, if you could tell us a little bit about the symposium that you've had accepted for ICCB in Kigali. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I had a symposium accepted for ICCB essentially on discussing some of these interdisciplinary ways to think about conservation crime. And so it's a little bit weird. It involves criminology, also computational sciences. So I do a lot of work with computer scientists now and engineers, and also like machine learning, and also like supply chain management people. So I have a couple of grants that are really trying to take these interdisciplinary like systems approaches to understanding wildlife crime. So what we want to talk about is kind of profiling some of the work that we're doing. Like, what does it look like to use operations engineering models and apply them to wildlife trafficking problem sets. I also have a project that's looking at wildlife trafficking in physical and also virtual crime ecosystems, right? So wildlife trafficking is increasingly moving online. And so how are we supposed to connect the online crime ecosystem with the physical crime ecosystem for law enforcement? So a lot of these things relate on data and sort of how can we, do a better job using scientific information for decision making. So we'll have four or five speakers. We are all women scientists and we are diverse. We have a Romanian, a Ukrainian, an American, and I'm hoping for two Africans as well. So we're really trying to promote diversity.
Fantastic, Meredith. We look forward to that symposium. And we look forward to seeing you in Kigali.
Yay!
Great. Well, Meredith, really thank you very much for giving us your time today and getting up so early to join us. And we've really enjoyed listening to this talk, and it's an incredibly important topic for discussion. So I'm hoping that as what will come out of this webinar is that more discussion about conservation criminology, more discussion about how we can bring in experts from different fields to address the issues of how we stop crime in our landscapes and our wild places. So thanks very much for this great presentation today. And we look forward to seeing you in Kigali. And thank you to all of the listeners for joining. And wherever you are in the world, we hope that it's been a great session for you, that you've learned a lot from Meredith. And we hope to see you for our next Conservation Voices webinar next month. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Meredith. Goodbye
Thanks,
for now.
everybody. Bye.